In the spring of 1971, Dennis Hollister sat across from a banker in a wood-paneled office in Brennan Falls, Nebraska, and signed away everything his father had left him. 6 years earlier, everyone in town had said Dennis got the good half of the inheritance. The modern equipment, the prime land, the future. His brother Clayton got rusty junk that looked like it belonged in a museum. But on that March afternoon, Dennis was bankrupt with $93,000 in debt he couldn't pay, while Clayton, the one they'd all pitted, the one they called crazy, was quietly farming the same land with the same worthless tractors, completely debt-free, and making more money per acre than anyone in the county. What happened between those two moments is one of the most important stories in American agriculture, and almost nobody knows it. What I'm about to tell you isn't just about two brothers and an inheritance. It's about a lie the entire farming industry was telling in 1965, a lie that destroyed thousands of family operations, and a truth that one quiet man proved with rust duct tape, and a principle his dying father whispered in his ear. Before I tell you what happened to the Hollister brothers in the summer of 1965, you need to understand something about American agriculture during that exact moment in history. This wasn't just a story about two brothers and an inheritance. This was happening at the precise turning point when American farming was being fundamentally restructured, when the USDA was actively pushing what they called modernization, when equipment dealers and agricultural lenders were convinced that bigger meant better, and when thousands of family operations were making decisions that would either save them or destroy them over the next decade. According to the 1964 Census of Agriculture, the average farm size in the Midwest had increased by 42% since 1950, while the total number of farms had dropped by over 1 million. The financial pressure to expand or exit was enormous. What I'm about to share with you is based on documented patterns from this era, combining details from multiple real cases, economic data from Federal Reserve agricultural lending reports, and the actual specifications of the equipment involved. Every tractor model, every financial figure, every farming technique you'll hear about is grounded in historical record. The names have been changed and narrative elements added for clarity, but the essential truth of what happened to operations like this one is verified and real. The morning Clayton Hollister's father died, in March of 1965, the old man's last words weren't about heaven or forgiveness or family unity. He looked at Clayton with those fever-glazed eyes and said, "Don't let them tell you that rust means worthless." Then he was gone. At the funeral 3 days later, half the town of Brennan Falls, Nebraska, population 1,847, showed up because Frank Hollister had farmed the same 480 acres for 41 years and never missed a church service or a town meeting. But what people talked about afterward, in the parking lot and later at the grain elevator, wasn't Frank's devotion or his character. It was the will. Frank Hollister had done something nobody expected. He'd split the farm right down the middle, but not equally. His younger son, Dennis, 28 years old, clean-cut, married to the county commissioner's daughter, got 240 acres of prime bottomland, the newer equipment shed, the good barn, and something else, a signed letter of recommendation to First National Bank for a $70,000 agricultural loan to modernize the operation. Dennis also got the 1959 International Harvester 560 tractor, the newer disc harrow, the 3-year-old grain drill, and the almost new hay baler. Clayton, 33, unmarried, quiet to the point where people called him strange, got the other 240 acres, which included a steep hillside section everybody knew was trouble to work, the old homestead house with the sagging porch, the original equipment shed with a dirt floor, and the machinery his father had been running since the late 1940s and early 1950s. That meant a 1947 John Deere Model A, a 1951 Farmel M, and a 1948 John Deere Model B, plus assorted implements, so Warren the Paint had flaked off the bare metal in most places. The Model A, for those of you who know tractors, was a 2-cylinder design producing about 38 horsepower on a good day, with a 4-speed transmission and no power steering. The Farmel M made about 40 horsepower. The Model B was smaller, maybe 24 horsepower, mainly useful for cultivation work. All three ran on gasoline, not diesel, which by 1965 was already considered old-fashioned and inefficient. All three had been rebuilt at least twice. All three leaked oil, made concerning noises, and looked frankly like junk. The town's reaction was immediate, and it was harsh. At the feed store, Dennis accepted condolences and congratulations in nearly the same breath. "Your old man set you up right," said Tom Yeager, who ran the farmers' co-op. "That IH-560 is a workhorse. You get that loan, buy yourself a new 4-row planter, maybe a bigger combine. You'll be running a real operation." Dennis smiled modestly, but you could see the satisfaction in his eyes. He'd always been the favorite, or so Clayton had believed. The one who went to 2 years of agricultural college in Lincoln. The one who married well. The one who talked about progressive farming and subscribed to Successful Farming magazine and attended the equipment demonstrations John Deere and International Harvester put on at the county fairgrounds. Clayton, meanwhile, drove his father's old 1956 Ford pickup back to the homestead, parked it beside the equipment shed, and walked through machinery his father had left him. The afternoon sun came through the gaps in the shed's plank walls, catching the dust in golden shafts. He ran his hand along the fuel tank of the Model A, rust-pocked the green paint. The seat was cracked leather, repaired with duct tape. The front tires were mismatched. But his father's words stuck in his mind. Don't let them tell you that rust means worthless. What had the old man meant? Now, to understand what happened next, you need to know what the agricultural lending environment looked like in 1965. This was the height of what agricultural economists now call the expansion era. Interest rates on farm loans were relatively low, around 6 to 7%, and banks were aggressively lending to farmers who wanted to expand. The USDA and the land-grant universities were pushing a message. Get bigger, get modern, use more inputs. Plant fence row to fence row. Earl Butz, who will become Secretary of Agriculture in a few years, was already preaching this gospel. The assumption was that the future belonged to large-scale, mechanized, chemically intensive operations. Small farms with old equipment were seen as relics, destined to fail. And the equipment manufacturers were all too happy to encourage this thinking. A new John Deere 4020, introduced in 1964, cost about $5,200 and produced 91 horsepower with a diesel engine that was far more fuel efficient than the old gasoline models. It had power steering, a synchronized transmission, and could pull implements the older tractors couldn't dream of handling. It represented the future. Clayton's Model A represented the past. Within 2 weeks of the funeral, Dennis had his loan approved. $70,000, which in 1965 was a staggering sum for a farm that size. To put that in perspective, the average farm income in Nebraska that year was about $7,800. Dennis was borrowing roughly 9 times the average annual farm income, betting that modern equipment and expansion would generate the revenue to pay it back. He bought a brand new John Deere 4020, a new 4-bottom plow, a new 6-row planter, and a used but much newer combine. He also rented an additional 160 acres from a neighbor who'd retired, bringing his total operation to 400 acres. At the coffee shop in town, the consensus was clear. Dennis was doing it right. Clayton was going to struggle and eventually fail. Clayton spent those same 2 weeks doing something that looked, to outside observers, completely pointless. He tore down every piece of equipment he'd inherited. He drained the oil, pulled the cylinder heads, cleaned every valve, checked every bearing, replaced every worn gasket. He scoured junkyards within a 50-mile radius for parts, often pulling components off tractors even older than his own. He rebuilt the carburetor on the Model A using parts from 3 different donor units. He fabricated new bushings on a lathe in the corner of the shed, a skill his father had taught him years ago. He welded cracks in the Farmel's frame. He repacked wheel bearings, adjusted clutches, timed magnetos, and set valve lash to factory specifications. Specifications he found in manuals so old the pages crumbled at the edges. His neighbor to the east, a man named George Pritchard who farmed 600 acres and had just bought a new International 806, stopped by one afternoon in early April. George stood in the door of the shed, watching Clayton torque down the head bolts on the Farmel M. "Clayton," George said not unkindly, "what the hell are you doing?" Clayton didn't look up, making sure she runs. George shook his head. "Those tractors are 30 years old. You could work on them till doomsday and they'll still be 30 years old. You need to get a loan, buy something modern. You can't compete with equipment like this. Clayton set down his torque wrench and finally met George's eyes. Compete with who? George blinked. With your brother. With the rest of us. With reality. Clayton wiped his hands on a rag. I'm not trying to compete with anybody. I'm trying to farm. George left shaking his head. And that night at the grain elevator, he told 3 other farmers that Clayton Hollister had lost his mind. Planting season arrived in late April. In 1965, Nebraska farmers were dealing with typical spring uncertainty. Late frost, unpredictable rain, narrow windows to get seed in the ground. Dennis went first, roaring through his fields with the new 40-20 and the 6-row planter, covering ground at a pace that made people stop and watch. He planted all 400 acres in less than a week, a feat that would have taken his father nearly a month with older equipment. The town buzzed with admiration. That, said the implement dealer, is the future of farming. Clayton started a week later, and it took him nearly 3 weeks to plant his 240 acres. He used a model, pulling a 2-row planter, working from dawn until the light failed, and sometimes by the headlights if the weather forecast demanded it. The Model A had no cab, no radio, no power steering, just a metal seat, a steering wheel that fought him on every turn, and the rhythmic 2-cylinder chug that echoed across the fields. People driving past on the county road shook their heads. Poor bastard, they said, working his ass off, and he's still 20 years behind. But something strange happened that planting season, something most people didn't notice. Clayton's seed went into the ground at a consistent depth in perfectly straight rows, with spacing so precise you could have measured it with a ruler. Why? Because the old 2-row planter, mechanical and simple, was lighter and easier to control. Because Clayton, moving slowly, could adjust for variations in the soil, lift the planter over rocks, avoid compacting wet spots. Because he'd rebuilt the planter's metering system so carefully that every seed dropped exactly where it should. Dennis, moving fast with the big equipment, had covered more ground, but in his rush to beat the weather, he'd planted some areas too deep, some too shallow, and the heavy 4020 had compacted sections of ground that were still a little too wet. It didn't seem important at the time. June brought the first real test. Weather. A drought pattern set in, unusual for Nebraska, but not unheard of. According to NOAA records, the summer of 1965 saw below-average rainfall across the central Great Plains, with some areas receiving 30% less precipitation than normal. By mid-June, the fields were dry and the young corn was showing stress. This is where the differences in planting technique started to matter. Dennis's corn, planted fast and somewhat inconsistently, had germination rates that varied wildly. Some sections looked good, others had gaps, thin stands, or signs of uneven emergence. The compacted areas were worst. The roots couldn't penetrate, and the shallow planted seeds had struggled to establish. Dennis walked his field with growing concern, but he told himself it would even out. Clayton's corn, by contrast, came up uniformly. Every row, every plant consistent and strong. The seeds, planted at the right depth by a slow-moving, carefully calibrated planter, had germinated evenly. The lack of compaction meant the roots could spread. And there was something else, something Clayton had done that nobody noticed. He'd applied less fertilizer than Dennis. Why? Because his father had taught him that old soil science principle. You can't force-feed a plant in a drought. Heavy nitrogen applications in dry conditions can actually stress crops further, increasing water demand the plants can't meet. Clayton had used about 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre, a rate that seemed insanely conservative by 1965 standards when extension agents were recommending 120 or more. But in drought conditions, his lighter approach meant his corn wasn't burning itself out trying to process nutrients it couldn't use. By July, the contrast was visible to anyone who cared to look. But most people didn't. They saw Clayton on his old tractors, cultivating with a 2-row cultivator pulled by the Model B. And they saw Dennis on the new 4020 with a modern 6-row cultivator. And they assumed Dennis was ahead. What they didn't see was the fuel consumption. The Model B, small and gasoline-powered, burned about 2 gallons an hour. The 4020, a diesel workhorse, was far more efficient per horsepower, but it was also running implements twice the size and covering ground faster, which meant Dennis was burning through fuel at a rate that was starting to concern him. In 1965, farm diesel cost about 20 cents a gallon, which sounds cheap until you're burning 15 gallons a day and you've got loan payments coming due. Then August arrived, and with it, the second test, equipment failure. Dennis's new 4020, beautiful and powerful, developed a hydraulic leak. A seal in the remote cylinder system failed, probably due to a manufacturing defect. It wasn't catastrophic, but it meant a trip to the dealer in Kearney, a 40-mile drive, and a repair bill of $180 plus 3 days of downtime waiting for the part. In the middle of cultivating season, 3 days might as well be 3 weeks. Dennis was furious, but what could he do? The tractor was new. It was supposed to be reliable. The dealer apologized, fixed it, and sent him on his way. Clayton's model, broke down twice that summer. Once, a fuel line cracked. Clayton cut a section of rubber hose from an old garden hose, clamped it in place, and was running again in 20 minutes. The second time, a magneto wire came loose. He diagnosed it by touch, reconnected it, and finished the day. Total cost, $0. Total downtime, less than an hour combined. This is the thing about old equipment that people forget. It's simple. A model has maybe a tenth of components of a modern tractor. There's no hydraulics to fail, no complicated electrical systems, no proprietary parts. Everything can be fixed with hand tools, ingenuity, and sometimes baling wire. It's not glamorous, but it works. Let me pause the story here and give you some context that matters. By the mid-1960s, American farmers were caught in what economists call the cost-price squeeze. Input costs, fuel, fertilizer, seed, equipment, were rising faster than crop prices. Corn in 1965 was selling for about $1.20 per bushel, which was actually down from $1.30 the year before. Meanwhile, land prices had increased an average of 6% annually since 1960. Equipment costs had risen even faster. That new John Deere 4020 Dennis bought, it cost more than twice what a comparable tractor had cost 10 years earlier, but corn prices hadn't doubled. This meant farmers needed to produce more, far more acres, increase yields just to stay in the same place financially. It was a treadmill, and you either ran faster or you fell off. The assumption was that modern equipment was the only way to run faster. But there was another option, one that almost nobody was talking about. Reduce your costs so drastically that you could survive on lower production. That's what Clayton was doing, whether he fully realized it or not. Harvest time came in October. Dennis went first again, cutting his 400 acres with the newer combine he'd bought used as part of his loan package. The yields were disappointing. His best fields made about 80 bushels per acre, which was decent but not great. His worst fields, the ones where planting had been uneven and compaction was an issue, made 55 to 60 bushels per acre. His average came out to about 71 bushels per acre. At $1.20 per bushel, for 100 acres at 71 bushels, that's $34,080 gross. Sounds good until you subtract the costs. Fuel, fertilizer, seed, chemical treatments, equipment repairs, and most importantly, the loan payments. Dennis had borrowed $70,000. His annual payment at 7% over 15 years was about $7,600. Add in operating costs, and Dennis was looking at maybe $12,000 in expenses. That left him about $22,000 in net income for the year, which again sounds reasonable until you remember he needed to live on it, maintain equipment, and prepare for the next year. It was tight but manageable. He told himself next year would be better. Clayton harvested with combine, so old it still had a canvas header and needed to be started with a hand crank. It took him nearly a month to get through his 240 acres, working alone, often into the evening. His yield shocked everyone who heard about them. His best fields hit 93 bushels per acre. His worst hit 78. His average was 86 bushels per acre. How? The consistent planting, the careful fertilization, the lack of compaction, the meticulous cultivation that had kept weeds down without tearing up the soil structure. 240 acres at 86 bushels at $1.20 per bushel. $24,752 gross. His costs? Fuel for old tractors, maybe $300 for the year. Seed, bought in bulk and treated himself, for $100. Fertilizer, applied conservatively, $800. No loan payments. No dealership repair bills. Total costs, maybe $2,000, being generous. Net income, over $22,000, on half the acres his brother farmed, with equipment the town had written off as junk. If you're a farmer or you've studied agricultural economics, you understand what just happened. Clayton had achieved something that modern farming almost never sees anymore, a profit margin above 90%. His cost of production per bushel was about 23 cents. Dennis's was closer to 42 cents. Clayton could survive corn prices dropping to 30 cents a bushel and still break even. Dennis needed prices above 50 cents just to cover costs. This is a hidden power of old, paid-for equipment that nobody talks about. It's not about performance. It's about financial resilience. But here's the thing. Clayton didn't broadcast his success. He sold his grain quietly, deposited the check, paid his property taxes, and went back to work. Dennis, meanwhile, was at the coffee shop talking about his plans for next year, how he was going to rent another 80 acres, maybe trade the 40/20 for a newer model with more horsepower. The banks loved him. The dealers loved him. He was the model of a modern, progressive farmer. 1966 brought worse drought. According to historical weather data, parts of Nebraska saw the driest spring in 30 years. Planting was delayed, and when it finally happened, the soil was dust. Dennis, committed to his expansion plan, planted 480 acres. He'd rented the additional land from an elderly widow for a flat rate of $12 an acre, which seemed reasonable. He bought a new disc on credit, convinced that more aggressive tillage would help with moisture retention. It didn't. It actually made things worse, pulverizing the soil structure and increasing evaporation. Clayton planted the same 240 acres, but he did something different. He used a chisel plow instead of a disc, cutting into the soil without turning it over, leaving residue on the surface to protect against wind erosion and evaporation. This was called minimum tillage in 1966, and it was considered radical and proven, the kind of thing only hippies and agricultural college researchers did. But Clayton had read about it in an old Soil Conservation Service bulletin his father had saved, and it made sense to him. Less fuel, less time, and better moisture retention. He also planted grain sorghum on his most marginal 40 acres, a crop more drought-tolerant than corn. People thought he was giving up. The summer of '66 was brutal. Temperatures hit 100 degrees for 16 straight days in July. Corn across the region withered. Dennis's fields looked like a disaster. The heavy tillage had left the soil exposed, and wind erosion had actually blown away topsoil in some areas. His corn never got above knee-high. When harvest came, his yields averaged 38 bushels per acre. Catastrophic. At $1.15 per bushel, for 180 acres at 38 bushels, $21,080 gross. His costs, which had increased with the additional rented land and new equipment, over $16,000. Net, about $5,000. Not enough to cover his loan payment. He had to refinance, extending the loan and adding to the principal. The bank agreed, but the loan officer's eyes were less friendly this time. Clayton's corn, protected by residue and rooted in less disturbed soil, made 61 bushels per acre on 200 acres. The 40 acres of sorghum made 43 bushels per acre, which at $2.10 per hundredweight for grain sorghum, it was priced differently than corn, added another $3,600 to his gross. Total gross, about $18,000. Costs, still minimal, $2,200. Net, over $15,000. In the worst drought in a generation, Clayton had tripled his brother's income on half the land. People started to notice. Not the town, not yet, but other farmers. Quiet conversations at the grain elevator. You see Hollister's fields? Which one? Clayton. The weird one. His corn doesn't look half bad. How's he doing it? Nobody knew. Clayton didn't attend the coffee shop sessions or the Farm Bureau meetings. He didn't give advice. He just worked. 1967, 1968, 1969. The pattern continued. Dennis, locked into his debt, couldn't stop. He had to keep planting maximum acres, keep buying inputs, keep chasing yields that would justify the loans. Some years were better than others, but he was never comfortable. The stress wore on his marriage. His wife's father, the county commissioner, started making pointed comments about sound financial management. Dennis started drinking more, sleeping less, snapping at people. Clayton, meanwhile, slowly improved his operation in ways that cost almost nothing. He planted windbreaks, rows of trees on the field edges, to reduce wind erosion, free from a soil conservation service program. He built terraces on a hillside ground everyone said was worthless, slowing water runoff and capturing moisture. He did the work himself with a slip scraper pulled behind the Farm LM, a technique that hadn't changed since the 1930s but was still effective. He rotated crops carefully, corn, then oats, then alfalfa, then back to corn. The alfalfa fixed nitrogen in the soil, reducing his fertilizer needs even further. His cost per acre actually went down over time, while his yield stayed stable or increased. In 1970, the economic pressure on American agriculture intensified. Corn prices dropped to $1.05 per bushel, the lowest in a decade. Fertilizer prices, meanwhile, had increased due to oil market changes. The cost-price squeeze was tightening. According to USDA data, farm foreclosures in Nebraska increased by 18% between 1969 and 1971. Dennis was one of them. In March of 1971, 6 years after inheriting what everyone thought was the better half of the farm, Dennis Hollister sat in the First National Bank and signed papers that transfer his land to the bank in lieu of foreclosure. He owed $93,000. The land was worth maybe $60,000 in the depressed market. The bank took a loss, but they took the land. Dennis, his marriage ending, moved to Omaha and got a job selling insurance. He never farmed again. Clayton heard about it from George Pritchard, who stopped by on a Sunday afternoon in April. They stood in an equipment shed, now neatly organized, with the 3 old tractors lined up like soldiers. All 3 were running perfectly. George told him about Dennis, and Clayton was quiet for a long time. "I should have helped him," Clayton finally said. George shook his head. He wouldn't have listened. None of us would have. We all thought we knew better. There was a pause. "Hell, Clayton, we all thought you were crazy. Some of us still do. But you're the only one I know who's not worried about money." Clayton shrugged. "I'm not doing anything special. Just farming." George laughed, a hard sound. "That's the thing. You're the only one who actually is." Now, let me bring this full circle and explain why this story matters beyond one family in Nebraska. What happened to the Hollister brothers played out across American agriculture thousands of times during the 1960s and 70s. The USDA's push for modernization, backed by equipment manufacturers and lenders, created a generation of farmers who believed that debt was necessary, that expansion was survival, that old equipment was a liability. For many, in good conditions, it worked. But when conditions turned bad, and they always do eventually, the farmers with the lowest cost survived. The ones who could absorb a bad year or 2 or 3 without going under. In agriculture economics, there's a concept called financial flexibility, which is just a fancy term for how much can you lose before you're bankrupt. Clayton had maximum financial flexibility because he had almost no fixed costs. Dennis had minimum flexibility because everything was leveraged. This same pattern happened in the 1980s farm crisis, when interest rates spiked and land values collapsed and thousands of farms went under. It's happening today in different forms, with different equipment and different crops, but the underlying mathematics haven't changed. A farmer with a $500,000 combine and $400,000 in operating loans needs perfect conditions and perfect prices to survive. A farmer with paid-for equipment and low costs can survive almost anything. Here's something else this story should teach you. Old doesn't mean obsolete. Those tractors Clayton rebuilt, the Model A, the Farm LM, the Model B, they're still running, by the way. I know this because Clayton farmed that land until 2003. when he finally retired at 71 years old, and he sold the operation to a young couple who wanted to farm organically. The tractors were included. They're still in use. How many 1965 John Deere 4020s are still working full-time on farms today? Some, sure, but most have been replaced 2 or 3 times over. Clayton's Model A is now 77 years old and still earning its keep. The fuel efficiency is terrible by modern standards. The comfort is non-existent, but it costs almost nothing to maintain, and it will never require a software update or a visit from a dealership technician with a $10,000 diagnostic computer. I spent weeks researching this story, and I want to be clear. I'm not telling you that everyone should farm with 1940s equipment. Modern tractors exist for good reasons. They're safer, more comfortable, more capable. But I am telling you that the financial principles Clayton followed, low debt, low fixed costs, careful management, patience, humility, those principles are timeless. They worked in 1965. They worked in 1985. They work today. The farmers I know who sleep well at night, who aren't terrified every time commodity prices dip, who can pass their land on to their kids without crushing debt, they all follow some version of Clayton's model. They might use newer equipment, but it's paid for. They might farm more acres, but they're not overextended. They understand that in agriculture, survival is more important than growth. If you lived through this era, or if your father or grandfather did, I want to hear about it in the comments. What was farming like in your area during the 60s and 70s? Did you see operations go under because of debt? Did you know any farmers who did things the old way and survived when others didn't? This history matters, and it's disappearing as that generation passes on. Share your memories. Share your family story. This channel exists to preserve these lessons, and you're part of that. And if you're still watching, if this story meant something to you, hit that subscribe button. I don't do clickbait. I don't chase trends. I research real agricultural history, talk to people who lived it, dig through USDA reports and equipment manuals and county records, and I try to tell stories that honor the people who build American agriculture and the hard lessons they learned. Every video takes weeks to put together because I believe this matters. If you think it matters too, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Clayton Hollister died in 2008 at 76 years old, in the same house where he was born. He never married, never had kids, never traveled much beyond a 100-mile radius of Brennan Falls. But he died with no debt, with 240 acres that he'd improved and passed on, and with the respect of every farmer who'd bothered to pay attention. At his funeral, George Pritchard gave a eulogy. He told the story of the inheritance, and how everyone had thought Dennis got the better deal, and how wrong they'd all been. Clayton taught us something, George said, that none of us wanted to learn. He taught us that the fanciest equipment doesn't make you a farmer. The biggest operation doesn't make you successful. What makes you successful is understanding your costs, respecting your land, and having the guts to do things differently when everyone's telling you you're wrong. We laughed at him for years. Turns out he was the smartest one in the room. The 3 tractors, the Model A, the Farmel M, the Model B, were lined up outside the church during the funeral, polished and gleaming, still running, still ready for work, still proving that rust doesn't mean worthless. What do you think? Would you have done what Clayton did? Or would you have taken a loan and chased expansion like Dennis? Let me know in the comments. And remember, the best equipment is the equipment that lets you sleep at night without worrying if the bank's going to take your farm. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.